Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? I will go ahead and welcome everyone. I want to welcome the members of Congress that are joining us. I will call them out specifically here in a moment. Welcome, of course, to the members of congressional staff that are with us and others who are joining us for what I think is one of the most timely and important forums that we've ever undertaken at the Congressional Freethought Caucus. Tonight, we are going to delve into Christian nationalism and the prominent role that it played in the January 6th Capitol insurrection. And for many of us, the religious imagery and the messaging on that terrible day were conspicuous, and it was everywhere. You saw video footage and photos of Trump flags and riot gear intermixed with the ubiquitous crosses, the Jesus 2020 flags. I remember seeing a banner that said Trump is the Geodis. And I wondered, what is Geodis? And I saw on social media that it means God Emperor of the United States. No kidding. People had a banner that said that on January 6th. And of course, there was all the surreal footage of the insurrectionists leading each other in prayer, even pausing their rampage on the floor of the United States Senate to solemnify the occasion in the name of Jesus Christ. As we reflect on the horrors of that day, that dangerous mixing of religion and power and violence really demands our attention. And that's what tonight is all about. We have an outstanding panel of experts to lead us through this really important conversation. And I want to specifically recognize, just sort of looking at my screen, I see Congressman Jerry McNerney. I see Congressman Steve Cohen. I see Congressman Mark Pocan from Wisconsin, Congressman Sean Casten from Illinois, and Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia. I'm not sure that Congressman Jamie Raskin is with us just quite yet, but when he does join us, I know he's going to be here tonight. I'll try to give him a chance for any opening thoughts as co-chair that he would like to offer. But right now, I want to go ahead and introduce the gentleman who's going to moderate tonight's conversation, and we are in good hands tonight because Andrew Seidel is an author and a constitutional and civil rights attorney of great renown. He is director of strategic response at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. He works there to keep state and church separate and to educate the public about non-belief. His first book is called The Founding Myth: Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. It came out 20 months before Christian nationalists sacked the Capitol. And it certainly has proven to be an amazing subtitle. The subtitle of his book is quite correct. Andrew writes widely in numerous outlets and is working on a second book called Weaponizing Religious Freedom. It's due out next spring. So I think you'll agree he's a great person to lead us through this conversation. Let me quickly introduce the other panelists who Andrew is going to be leading in a dialogue. First, let's welcome Amanda Tyler. She is executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee. I think it's terrific tonight that we have both secularists and religionists in this conversation. And Amanda often speaks in churches, educational institutions, and denominational gatherings on church and state issues, speaks to the media a lot. She is a lawyer with experience working in Congress and private practice. She was named one of the nation's top 50 nonprofit leaders in 2018. She was named Baptist of the Year by ethicsdaily.com in 2019. And we're glad to have her. She serves as co-host of the Respecting Religion series on the Baptist Joint Commission podcast. Amanda, thanks for joining us tonight. Next on our panel is going to be Robert Jones. He is the CEO and founder of Public Religion Research Institute and a committee member for the American Academy of Religion. He's published several books on white supremacy's historic and current relationship with Christianity in this country. And before creating the Public Religion Research Institute, he was a professor of religious studies at Missouri State University and a fellow at multiple think tanks in Washington, D.C. His work has been featured on numerous national television outlets and also in the Washington Post. Mr. Jones, welcome. And then finally, Juhem Navarro Rivera is a political scientist, a writer, a public speaker, and a research consultant. He is the political research director and the managing partner at Socioanalytica Research, and he's a senior fellow at the Institute for Humanist Studies. Mr. Navarro Rivera's work has been featured in publications such as The Humanist, and he has also written in, I've got other Religious News Service and other outlets as well. So we welcome his expertise and perspective. Andrew Seidel, I'm going to hand off to you right now. Let me check one more time to see if Jamie Raskin has joined us yet. I don't yet see him, but we're going to give him jump-in privileges when he does join us. I'm going to hand off to you right now, though, Andrew. Really looking forward to this panel.
I agree to the jump-in privileges. Thank you very much, Representative Huffman. So I'm just going to do like a very brief recap before we get to the whole panel here, because Christian nationalism really did rip its mask off on January 6th. And the conversation that some of us had been having on the margins entered the mainstream in the wake of those attacks. Amanda and BJC had been warning about it for more than a year. Robert and Juhem had been studying it, and some of the demographic changes that are driving the fear and possibly the rise of Christian nationalism. I wrote a book saying it was un-American and called it an existential threat to our republic on the book tour. And since this happened, I've been scouring, along with Robbie, it sounds like, photos and videos and court cases, and I am more convinced than ever before about the role that Christian nationalism played. So I just want to set the stage a little bit, especially since some of you actually experienced this from a very different perspective. The day actually kicked off with Paula White giving a prayer that added the United States of America to the Lord's Prayer that is written in Matthew 6. That rally ended with Trump calling on his mob to march to the Capitol. His last words were, "God bless you and God bless America." On their march to the Capitol, the Proud Boys were hailed as God's warriors, and they knelt in prayer and with a full typical Christian nationalist rhetoric about restoring the nation. One of the attackers carried a Christian flag onto the floor of the Senate. Representative Huffman already mentioned that the absurdly self-proclaimed QAnon shaman led a prayer in the Senate about patriotism and Jesus and restoring the nation, and ended that prayer in Jesus's name. One of the other praying insurrectionists actually gave an interview later and talked about that prayer and said that we were just there to consecrate the Senate to Jesus. We consecrated it to Jesus. And quote, "That to me was the ultimate statement of where we are in this movement." A third praying insurrectionist posted a selfie video saying, "I just wanted to get inside the building so I could plead the blood of Jesus over it. That was my goal." And he said that when he goes to prison for his crimes, he's going to start a prison ministry. Another insurrectionist told her social media followers that why she invaded the Capitol. "To me," she said, "God and country are tied. To me, they're one and the same. We were founded as a Christian country." And as Representative Huffman said, the imagery now is infamous. The huge wooden cross juxtaposed with the gallows from which they wanted to hang people. They signed the gallows as if they were writing, signing each other's yearbooks, writing, "Hang them high, in God we trust, God bless the USA, hang for treason, and amen." I mean, the flags and signs were clear. "Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president" was one I saw everywhere. "One nation under God, in God we trust, Jesus saves, Jesus 2020, Bible verses, crosses." One sign simply said, "I am on your side," signed God. A Bible was seen raised above the crowd as they surged through one of the entrances. There was actually a Catholic priest who went into the Capitol and admitted on camera to exorcising the demon Baphomet from the Capitol building. They sang the battle hymn of the Republic, "Glory, glory, hallelujah, his truth is marching on," and prayed in the rotunda. One group was called the Jericho March. They helped organize all of this. It was started by two federal workers who were sent visions from God to, quote, "let the church roar." And they organized this alongside the Stop the Steal charlatans. And it wasn't just the imagery and rhetoric, right? It was this devout belief that this is a Christian nation, that God chose Donald Trump. Trump himself said so. Everybody remembers, right? "I am the chosen one." That God's on their side. I mean, the attacker who kicked in Speaker Pelosi's door, hoping to, quote, "tear her into little pieces," was an attorney. And his rantings were recounted at one of his hearings. He said, quote, "God is on Trump's side. God is not on the Democrats' side. And if the patriots have to kill 60 million of these communists, it is God's will. So this was a white Christian nationalist mob. And that imagery is really illustrative, but to talk about Christian nationalism, the first thing we really have to do, I think, is define it for everybody. Define Christian nationalism and to the extent that we can, distinguish it from Christianity. And Amanda, why don't we go ahead and start with you? If you can offer us your working definition for Christian nationalism and how you might distinguish that from Christianity writ large.
Andrew, as you hand off to Amanda, can I quickly welcome 3 more members of Congress that have joined us? Susan Wild and Zoe Lofgren, and of course, my co-chair, Jamie Raskin. Jamie, I said earlier you would have jump-in privileges if you wanted to offer any introductory comments. So if you have something to help frame the conversation, it's all yours, and then I'll get out of Andrew's way and we'll hear from Amanda. He's muted, of course.
Thank you, Jared, and thanks to everybody for being here. As I was listening to Andrew, I was reflecting that they spent so long waiting for the resurrection, they just decided to settle for an insurrection. Okay, but I'm psyched to hear. I'm psyched to hear from all of our panelists, and forgive me for being late, Jared.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you, Congressman Huffman, Congressman Raskin, all members of Congress. It's really wonderful to be back with you. I did work for 8 years with Congressman Lloyd Doggett, your colleague, and so being back in this room in a caucus is really a pleasure for me. So we define at Baptist Joint Committee and more broadly in the initiative that BJC has been coordinating since July 2019, an initiative called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We define Christian nationalism as a political ideology and cultural framework that seeks to merge our identities as Christians and Americans. It suggests that to be a good Christian, one has to be an American, or to be a true American, one must be a Christian. And we reject this both as a threat to our constitutional democracy, to American pluralism, to religious freedom for all, but also a threat to our Christian faith. Because it sacrifices allegiance to God for allegiance to country. It puts nationalism ahead of patriotism in that way, and it seeks to kind of confuse political leadership with religious leadership. And so for all of these reasons, BJC in 2019 joined with a number of other religious groups to put together the Christians Against Christian Nationalism initiative. You can find out more information at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. And I wanted to point it out as a resource for everyone on a number of different levels. One, we have 22,000 Christians who have signed this statement to date, and they have committed to putting their names publicly on the website as standing against Christian nationalism. And so this is an open source resource for members of Congress that you can go and look in your congressional district and see which Christians are standing up against Christian nationalism and allies in this fight. And so I wanted to reference that for you. But we also have a number of resources available to everyone, Christians and everyone else, to understand Christian nationalism. And I'm just going to put in the chat right now a one-page resource that we have called What is Christian Nationalism? And this is something that is shareable and something that might be of use to everyone. I would say, when we talk about Christian nationalism, I already distinguished it from patriotism, but distinguishing it from Christianity as well. Christian nationalism is not a religion. It's more about identity than religion, as pointed out in the one-pager. It carries assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. But we can't, as Christians, we can't say it has nothing to do with Christianity. And I'm sure the other panelists will get to this point as well, but it uses Christian symbols, it uses Christian imagery, it uses Christian language to lend legitimacy to the ideology. And I think that gets to a lot of what happened on January 6th, was this idea of using Christianity and Jesus as a mascot to give legitimacy to their lawlessness and violence, to you have President Trump take on a messianic significance in a way that really upped the ante, for all of these actions in a really dangerous way.
It absolutely did that. I mean, it really did. It was an escalation, no doubt. Robbie and Juum, from your more demographic sort of anthropological studying this sort of demographics, how do you define it when you're looking at this?
Juum, you want to go ahead? No, go ahead. I'll follow you.
One of the things, as Amanda was talking, is that Christian nationalism, it does center whiteness, but it shouldn't be confused necessarily with white nationalism. I think it's independent, although kind of interdependent. But you don't have to be white to be a Christian nationalist. And one of the things growing up in Puerto Rico, where there's a lot of influence from the United States, of course, it's this aspect of knowing all these Christian nationalist figures because they have these amazing media presence, multi-language media presence. And so seeing figures like Enrique Tarrio of the Proud Boys, like being a Latinx Cuban American, being leader of this particular group, it's not a contradiction. It does center this identity that Amanda mentioned, but it doesn't necessarily it's exclusively white. It does center whiteness in a way in which I would say people accept certain hierarchies in American society, but it also, in many ways, also doesn't necessarily have to be Christian. It does have to accept the centrality of Christianity as an American value, but I think not coincidentally, given how a lot of the campaign, Trump campaign in 2016, especially, was against, Muslim Americans and Muslims in general. I think since 9/11, there's this element of, like not necessarily being a Christian but certain Christianity as the default and as the good part of American identity, contrasting it with like the increase in the Muslim population. And also, as Amanda mentioned, like it has that nativist appeal in there. So I think those are, even when we think about it, we don't have, it's predominantly white and it's predominantly nativist, but it doesn't necessarily exclude those populations as long as many other populations actually internalize those hierarchies within the ideology.
That's a really interesting observation. I mean, I think often when we are talking about Christian nationalism, we're talking about white Christian nationalism. And Robbie, I mean, your book, White Too Long, is right on that. So if you want to touch on that while you're defining it too, please do.
Yeah. Well, let me tip my hat to both Amanda and Juum, and they've covered a lot of the ground. And I'll just say thank you for having me here today. I'll tell you a little bit. Yeah. So I published a book that came out last year called White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy and American Christianity, where I took up and looked at some of these things. And, I want to say yes to Juum that it doesn't necessarily mean one has to be white to be a Christian nationalist, but I don't want to undersell the whiteness, right? That I think it's just very critical that this really is about white identity. And it's about the particular valence that has taken on in the late 20th century and into the 21st century as a kind of more tribal identity, kind of uber tribal identity, and the way it's been fused into religion and politics. And I think at the end of the day, like to me, the hermeneutical key for this is that it is, as I think as Amanda was saying, about ownership of the country, right? So I can kind of boil it down. It's about a kind of white Anglo-Saxon Christian ownership of the country, and this is very, very old in American history. So I think we're experiencing it as a kind of a new phenomenon.
Yes.
But it's very, very old. Like the roots of this are, and in fact, it is in fact really the version of Christianity that landed on our shores. That has to do with manifest destiny and the subjection of Native Americans and enslavement of Africans. Like, how does all that get justified? That gets justified through this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery. That's a 1493 Christian doctrine that says that, if anyone from European countries encounters people in lands that are not Christian, they have the authority of the church and the state that they represent to subjugate and dominate those peoples in the name of God, right? I mean, this is the version that lands there. And to show you how deep it is, I mean, I'm always astonished that a president that we think of as fairly progressive, FDR, infamously said, this is a Protestant nation and everyone else is here by sufferance, right? So these were sentiments that were said out loud really across the political spectrum through most of American history. I think what's different about the moment we're in are two things. I'll kind of stop there, but one of them is the changing demographics of the country. 2016, I wrote a book called The End of White Christian America, where I was looking at the changing demographics in the country. It is notable that all of this, the current moment we're in happens as the country is moving and has moved, in fact, over the last 10 years from being a majority white Christian country, demographically speaking, to one that is no longer a majority white Christian country, right? So in 2008, when Barack Obama was first running for president, the country was 54% white, non-Hispanic, and Christian. Today, that number is 44%, right? So during our first African Americans president's tenure in the White House, our nation crossed this momentous milestone of no longer being a white Christian country. And I think that is largely what has set off this visceral reaction. We saw it in the Tea Party. We've seen it more recently in the insurrection on the Capitol. But there's a thread that runs through this piece, and in fact, it runs back to the Southern strategy, that the GOP began in reaction to the civil rights movement. This is the end game, right? Of I think a long train that started picking up momentum after the civil rights movement, when white Christians essentially there was certainly white flight from cities to the suburbs. But there was also a white Christian flight from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party that began and was precipitated by the Democratic Party becoming associated as the party of civil rights. And we've seen this kind of go, and I think that's the other piece of this. So not only are we in this place where the first generation in American history, where we are not a demographically speaking majority white Christian country, where that lock on power is in fact threatened. We've never had a generation where that's true. And then the second thing is that these identities have coalesced around race, religion, and party, right? And we have this kind of visceral connection of these three powerful forces today.
Yeah, that's your 2016 book is a great book. I highly recommend that to everybody. And I define Christian nationalism basically as it is an identity. I think Amanda's right. It's this political identity, right? It is the idea that we're founded as a Christian nation, that we're based on Judeo-Christian principles. And importantly, I think that we've strayed from that foundation. And that's why they use the language of return and they've somehow lost this country, and they want to get back to those roots that Robbie's talking about. And we have seen waves of Christian nationalism throughout American history. This is the most recent wave that's going on for, 2 decades or so, maybe longer. And I think previously, certainly before the attack, it was viewed as sort of a scholarly debate about our history instead of the sinister exclusionary movement that you've just heard identified, instead of this attempt to redefine America according to the Christian nationalist identity. And then there's a piece that I'll add from the attorney standpoint. They're trying to reshape our law accordingly. The goal is to make it so that to be an American is to be a Christian, and to be a Christian is to be an American, but the right kind of Christian, right? Like not Amanda's kind of Christian. It has to be this kind of conservative Christian. And they base a lot of that identity, their claim to be the true heirs of the American experiment, on certain lies and myths about American history. And that's where a lot of this comes from, that we were founded as one nation under God, that we were founded as one nation in God we trust, that the Declaration of Independence references the Christian God 4 different times, that all the founders were evangelical Christians who prayed at the Constitutional Convention, that George Washington knelt in the snow and prayed at Valley Forge, and that our law is based on the 10 Commandments. Now, I tend to think that their identity is uniquely vulnerable because it's based on that disinformation, but I'll save that for a different time. I think it's really important to understand the role that Christian nationalism played in the rise of Trump, and then we can segue that into the attack on January 6th. So, Juum or Robbie, if you want to talk about this from the demographic standpoint in terms of how Trump tapped into that wave of Christian nationalism in 2016. I think that'd be useful too, and then we can talk about its role in January 6th more specifically.
Well, I'll jump in real quick. I've argued that Trump basically transformed, particularly white evangelicals, from being so-called values voters to being nostalgia voters, right? Where he kind of whipped them into a frenzy about, as you were saying, Andrew, about an America that was disappearing before their eyes, right? It was one in which, and in fact, one of the more predictive polling questions that we asked through the Trump era was whether American culture and way of life has changed for the better or changed for the worse since the 1950s. And what we found is that the country is basically divided on that question, but 2/3 of Republicans say it's changed for the worse, 2/3 of Democrats say it's changed for the better, but notably, nearly 3/4 of white evangelical Christians say it has changed for the worse. So when Trump so the Make America Great Again slogan, really that last word again is the most powerful piece of that slogan, and it kind of harkens back right to this kind of supposed golden age where white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in particular held sway, and particularly a conservative version of that held sway in America. So when you hear the rhetoric about like even on January 6th in that speech, you had Trump say, if you don't stand up and fight, America as you know it will be over, right? And that's been consistent in his speeches all the way from 2016 forward. And it's that, so if you interrogate that just a little bit, like whose America is he talking about, right? Who's we in those statements? And it really is a kind of white Christian appeal that he's made really consistently throughout. And we found that is that sense of loss and concern about a changing country. It was actually way more powerful than any sort of economic arguments or other arguments in the polling data that explains kind of white Christians' connection to Trump.
And Julian, I mean, there was that study by Whitehead and Perry showing that Christian nationalism was one of the best indicators of a Trump voter in 2016.
Yeah, I would add something that Robbie had mentioned previously, which is this decline of these white Christian demographics. And Robbie, you mentioned before going back to that Southern strategy, kind of like this more modern version of this iteration. But I would say that also that nativism that Amanda mentioned, it also harkens back to the 1965 immigration law and how like the liberalization of immigration into the United States and the increase, now the proportion of immigrants in the country has like reduced, but in the 90s it was actually, and early 2000s was actually peaking. So there's a lot of kind of like that Pete Wilson spirit that he captured in that 2016 run. And looking at that immigration aspect, it's not just looking in the sense of the kind of immigrants that are coming, because it's like particularly people from Asia, people from Latin America, many of them actually Christians, or most of them actually Christians, but not the right kind of Christian, in essence, not centered in whiteness as our immigration priority. And if we look at Trump as a president, like, and the role that immigration played is not only that he was against so-called quote illegal immigration, but also that he manufactured illegal immigration as it started removing people and nationalities from TSP status and the like. So that aspect of centering whiteness and the kind of immigrants that should be allowed in the country. There's something I run a secular voices survey last year in which I asked an experiment, and white evangelicals and white people in generally were not okay with or said that immigrants from Mexico changed America for the worse, but immigrants from Europe changed America from the better. So you have those elements in there in which, like, who should, even if we allow immigrants into the country, who should we allow? And in that sense, whiteness matters more than Christianity.
And I mean, Trump tapped into that rhetoric pretty clearly. And Amanda, I mean, you've talked about this too in the context of the religious freedom dog whistle.
Right, exactly. I mean, I can speak to it from observing Trump, not from demographic data, but the organization I lead, Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, we celebrate our 85th year anniversary this year. We are the only denominationally based organization working solely on protecting religious freedom for everyone on the national level in the country. And what we saw during the Trump years was a rapid acceleration of a narrowing of the definition of religious freedom used in the public, and how, in my view, religious freedom almost became a dog whistle to supporters about a very narrow set of policy positions, as opposed to an expansive idea of religious freedom for all, the idea that's in our Constitution and Article 6 and the No Religious Test Clause and the First Amendment of the Constitution. And the way that we've worked with Christians Against Christian Nationalism is to really put forward some of those founding ideals of religious freedom for all, ideas like people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square, and that one's religious affiliation or lack thereof should be irrelevant to one's standing in the civic community. All of these ideas of what religious freedom really means, we think, can unite people against Christian nationalism. And so, I want to encourage the caucus to embrace language of religious freedom for all, and reject the use of religious freedom, which is really code for Christian nationalism in many places. And we saw that really accelerated under Trump. And we've seen that unfortunately play out in some court decisions and in a lot of other areas in religious freedom law over the past several years as well.
Well, I'll
Andrew,
say
can I just
amen
one
to that.
quick coda to that?
Sure, go ahead, Robbie.
Absolutely right. And the one thing I think is to remember on this religious liberty topic is that the genesis of the modern way, in this kind of narrow way that religious liberty gets used today, has its roots in protecting white supremacy. It really was crafted by Falwell and others around protecting Bob Jones University, a Christian university, protecting their ability to have racially discriminatory practices on their campus without losing their tax exempt status during the Nixon and Carter administrations. And it was Jerry Falwell who coined this way of talking about religious liberty to really make an argument that they should be able to discriminate in this way and still have their IRS tax exemption be included. And they of course lost their tax exemption in that battle. But it's worth noting that that's the moment where we first get this kind of modern use of religious liberty to protect this very narrow version of conservative evangelical Christianity, and in this case, protect white supremacy along with it.
So I want to open it up to members' questions here. I'm going to add too, I think that it's pretty clear the best protection for genuine religious liberty, true religious liberty, not this sort of redefined dog whistle that we're talking about now, is a secular government. There's no such thing as the freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion. And before we get to members' questions, Representative McNerney, I know, has a question. Amanda already offered one suggestion for what Congress might do, recognizing true religious liberty. If anybody else has a suggestion, Robbie or Juam, on what Congress might do, we've got a bunch of members here, so I think we ought to take the time to touch on that first.
You want to go first, Robbie? Or?
Oh, go ahead.
One of the things I was thinking is, that we already took one type of religious identity extremism seriously with the 9/11 Commission looking at what happened. And I think Congress should use its powers of investigation to actually look deep into what happened in January 6th, and particularly try to root out the causes and the involvement of Christian nationalist groups in this particular event, and call it what it is as the investigation proceeds.
So add Christian nationalism as a thread of investigation to whatever commission investigates the attack. I love that idea. I think that's brilliant. Amanda, Robbie, you want to add anything?
I think that's right. I'll just kind of tag on to this that DOJ, I think, some of the statements I've read of threat assessment really use kid gloves or euphemisms around Christianity, not so much around Islam. But I think the kind of threat of and I also want to kind of make a play here to say that what we're really talking about, I'd like to always see the word white in front of Christian nationalism. That's really the threat that we're talking about. We're not talking about African American Christian nationalism as a big threat, or Latino Christian nationalism is a big threat. It really is white Christian nationalism, and that has to do with the history of it in our country. But I think just being clear about that and clear-eyed, and I think there's a kind of deference and kind of politeness, I think, that has been given Christianity historically, that I think it's time for us to be clear about what the threats really are and really name them, and not in a euphemistic way when we're kind of going, and say what it is we're investigating. There's plenty of scholarly work around to say why this is the topic that we're investigating.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too. I mean, call it out for what it is. Recognize that this is a threat, as Amanda said at the beginning, to our democratic system, to our pluralistic society. I also think there's something that Congress could do about some of the tangible relics that validate the Christian nationalist identity. Some of that disinformation I mentioned, we've endured these cyclical waves of Christian nationalism. And the Christian nationalists tend to kind of capitalize on their high watermarks of their power before they're relegated back to the fringe, and they leave behind footholds that make their next rise to power easier. In God We Trust on Our Coins and Money is a great example. Under God and the Pledge is another great example. National Day of Prayer. All of these things came at high watermarks for Christian nationalism. And if you have an entire identity, right, that's based on disinformation about what this country is and what it means to be an American, but that disinformation is validated every time they see In God We Trust on money or a government building, why else are they expending so much political capital, making those things happen? The beliefs are based on myths, but they are reassured and, indeed indoctrinated in ways. So I think we could spend some time talking about the undermining the lies and myths that support the Christian nationalist identity, the tangible physical artifacts that sort of uphold it, and maybe getting rid of some of those. So let's open it up. Representative Huffman, I know if you want to come in and manage, you're more than welcome to. I'm happy to just call on people, but Representative McNerney has been waiting patiently, so let's go to him.
I'll
first.
let you do the air traffic control, Andrew, between the members. I see some hands up, so that's great.
Okay.
Thanks, Ed. Hey, say, great panel. Thank you for coming out here. The more we educate people about this, I think the better off we're going to be. And I just want to follow up on Robert's point about the Department of Justice treating CN with kid gloves. I wrote a letter to the Department of Justice with about 20 signatures asking them to treat the insurrectionists with the same kind of justice that they advocated to treating Black Lives Matter during their protests in the summer. So that's very important. I was raised in a Catholic school. I went to Catholic schools for 12 years, and they always pointed out the importance of the separation of church and state. It may have been because the Catholics felt like they were not the center, not the Protestant mainstream. I'm not sure, but that point of separation was really brought home to me personally during the Iranian Revolution in 78, 79. They were hanging people with construction cranes in public. And Eric Severide, a newscaster at the time, said, "Don't let religion into politics because it's poison." And he pointed to those pictures, and it made clear to me, yeah, it really is poison. It's bad. Excuse me, it's bad enough dealing with on a day-to-day basis, but seeing people hung by construction cranes was really, to me, very visceral. So my question is for anyone that wants to take this, we tend to want to answer things in a reasoned way, whereas the Christian nationalists and the Republicans in general want to answer things in a very simple, repeated way, like God is good and government is bad. So we need to have a focused message that we can sort of fall back on in describing how to fight these sorts of ideas and movements that we're coming up against now. And it's becoming more urgent as we see on January 6th, but this thing's not over. I mean, we still have a big challenge ahead of us in convincing the 74 million people that voted for Trump that this is not a good path for our country. History's really clear on this.
Well, Representative, I would say to that, I would just refer to our resources at Christians Against Christian Nationalism. The center point of our campaign is a statement that people can sign. Anyone who self-identifies as a Christian can sign. And we have certain bullet points that are really a statement about the importance of separation of church and state and how that helps protect religious freedom for all. And we have found that, we've been running this campaign now for almost 2 years. And the feedback that we've gotten is that this language really helps to start conversations with people who maybe haven't questioned some of those assumptions that Andrew made, hadn't questioned the veracity of some of these myths, of some of the language, and that it helps to disarm a little bit and to approach conversations. And so I would just, kind of point to that resource as far as just kind of simple bullet point statements that can be clear about how to counteract Christian nationalism. And the feedback that we've gotten on the grassroots side, 22,000 signers, this is not a left-wing Christians, point. These are people from across the ideological and theological spectrum who have signed on to this. And so, not the kind of data that my colleagues work in, but I think this is good to show that this really works and that people, no matter how they come out on different policy issues or even their political persuasion, share concerns about Christian nationalism. This might be a good way to help have those conversations.
One just quick follow on, I think there are some really underutilized resources in the academy. I'm on the National Program Committee at the American Academy of Religion. There's a whole, cadre of really solid social science data, really solid religious studies data that could be a resource, right? So that, because like practically speaking, one of the deterrents is worries about being accused about going after Christian churches, in some, unjustified way. But there's a lot of data, right, that you could build, the case for this is exactly why, like we're following the best of the social sciences, the best of the political science that we have in front of us that tell us where these issues are. But I think those resources aren't tapped or utilized as well as they could be to kind of build the case as well from an academic and scholarly standpoint.
I mean, I think you hit on it a little bit in the beginning of your question too, Representative. I mean, the separation of state and church is a foundational American value. It is one of the truly unique things about our Constitution. It's an American original, an American invention, right? No other country had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely by separating religion and government until the American Republic. And I think that's something that we can and should be proud of. But the flip side of that is that Christian nationalism is fundamentally un-American. And that's why I chose the subtitle of the book that I chose. And I think it gets to your point about having this sort of, we can point to reason and we can point to history and we can say this is what the founding fathers actually said and this is what they actually meant, and have that logical debate, but it might not work. You do sometimes need that visceral argument as well. And I mean, Christian nationalists consider themselves to be true Americans, and trying to have that argument on a more visceral level, I think, is important. And I have found great success both in the work that I do at the Freedom from Religion Foundation and with the book by simply calling it out as un-American. We have a lot of hands up, so I'm going to go to Representative Pocan, who is the next hand that I saw up.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. And thanks, Jared, for putting this together. I do have to say I have this great organization in my district, Freedom from Religion Foundation, and I've got more people here per capita than any member of Congress online. I did put that out there. All right. Two question areas. One, I'm just curious, I often refer to the Southern Poverty Law Center, their hate guides is like one of the best. Do they take this as a separate category? And if not, can we try to convince them to? Because I think I love breaking it out like this, and I think that is a go-to resource. And the second question is just, and maybe, it's something we all know, I'm just wondering if there's actually any chatter about it, but Donald Trump is the most, according to the written values of Christianity, the most anti-Christian person I know, and yet he's their God and emperor. Does the disconnect bother people at all? I mean, I know, water and wine already and all that stuff, but does that disconnect exist? I'm just really curious.
I can take the second half of that question. I don't know the answer on the Southern. Yeah. Not that I can at all speak for all Baptists, let alone all Christians, but I do think that some people are so attached to Christian nationalism that they've really divorced from a conception of Christianity that many people would recognize, and so I think it kind of depends on where people are on that spectrum. I think that's a point we haven't really made super clearly yet, is that Christian nationalism, like racism, is an ideology that permeates all of American society. And so, there are certain people who are certainly more infected by Christian nationalism, but we all, just by virtue of living in this society, have absorbed it in some way. And so I think that maybe those who are most attached and wedded to Christian nationalism have a way of kind of stuffing down, some of those key Christian teachings, things like, for instance, about not having idols and not putting anything above God, and then we have Trump being put on a pedestal right along or even higher than God. So I think that there's a way that people have become more attached to Christian nationalism than Christianity itself.
Yeah, I was recently doing some research with the SPLC data. I don't recall exactly if they have several of the groups that have been mentioned in the conversation as hate groups, I believe, under white nationalism, but I don't recall exactly if they have Christian nationalism. But there's as Robbie has mentioned, like there's the centering of whiteness, so there's some capturing there. But since I work from my tablet and not from my computer, I don't really recall and can't actually access it right now.
Well, Representative Pocan, we can touch base with SPLC. I'll do that, and we'll get back to your office. I mean, this studying of Christian nationalism is kind of new. I mean, when I was writing the book before Trump rose to power, not many people were talking about it. Then all of a sudden, Morning Consult had a study after his election where 47% of the country recognized that it was a threat. We're seeing it more and more as a threat, and it permeates so many different things. It's the leading predictor, or among the leading predictors, on anti-vaccine attitudes, wanting to lift public health restrictions, whatever the cost, risky behaviors surrounding COVID, including gathering in public or eating in restaurants. There's a huge tie. I think somebody just put this study in the chat between belief in gun rights and Christian nationalism. I mean, it really is sort of the sum total of many of the deeply conservative beliefs out there. So, I mean, it really does kind of cut across a lot of the lines. So SPLC should certainly consider it.
Yep.
So I believe Representative Caston, you're next on my list. And you're on mute, sir.
This is fascinating. I really appreciate you guys doing this. I had done a very similar event to this back in my district. Wheaton Church is in my district, Wheaton College. And Ed Stetzer was kind enough to do something with me. And if you've not connected to him, would really encourage it. This is a guy who is deep within the evangelical tradition, who has been making these arguments within the evangelical faith, and I think somewhat lonelier. It'd be an interesting person to bring into this, because he's a deeply religious person, but saw many of the things that you all are talking about. So that's just a heads up. Happy to make the connection if you don't know him. You talked about how your manifest destiny piece is fascinating, and Bob Jones University, and using this to justify a lot of discriminatory practice. I wonder if any of you would comment on the fact that we do still live in a country where you can always make a racist angry by calling them a racist. So even though there are people who will make those claims, they will make them in very sort of oblique ways. LGBT discrimination is totally different because it's totally out in the open, and it strikes me that these groups are totally comfortable saying, you cannot attack my religious liberty, that I just don't want to hire these people because of their sexuality. How do you confront that? And am I right to conflate those two things together? Because it sounds the same way as you're describing this Jerry Falwell rhetoric, but in a way that's much harder to counter because it's so proudly proclaimed from the pulpit, if you will.
Well, yeah, thank you. I'll jump in. So, one of the, I think, troubling things that we're seeing is exactly on this point, that we're seeing this true among Republicans overall, and in particular among white evangelical Protestants. That's the kind of the base of the Republican Party. That today, if you ask who is facing a lot of discrimination in the country, Republicans and white evangelicals will say that white people and Christians are facing the most discrimination in the country. We had a battery of like 8 different groups that have historically faced discrimination in the country: African Americans, Jews, Catholics, Latinos, immigrants, and the like. And in that battery, white evangelicals were more likely to say that either Christians or white people were facing discrimination than any of those other groups. We also had LGBT people in the group, and more likely to say that they themselves were facing discrimination than any other group. So I think that's kind of been at the root of this kind of use of religious liberty that I talked about even with Bob Jones. It was about kind of the government discriminating against us, that kind of flipped around in that case. So I think that's one of the, but I think that is part of a strategy, again, when the demographic is shrinking. And I gave you the white Christian numbers overall, and back to the other representatives' question. One of the things we're seeing is that white evangelicals over the last years have declined from 21% of the population to 15% of the population today, just over the last since 2008. So that's notable as well, and that's true even in places like Texas and in Georgia. This decline is kind of across the board. But I think it's as they're declining, the arguments are getting shriller. And there is a kind of, what I would say, there's a kind of desperation here, right? Because in the past, they could sort of wink, wink, nod, nod, and know that they had the numbers to kind of hold on to control. And I think we're really at a tipping point here. And that's why I think we're seeing this expression of it take the form, and even into violence that it's taken, right? Is because now it really is the case that the country is beyond the tipping point. It's not going back, and there's a kind of desperate move to hold on to power. But I do think we are seeing it disturbing some people, and people are leaving with their feet. That's why we're seeing, and they're hemorrhaging young people in particular. Yeah. White evangelicals over the age of 60, or Americans over the age of 65 are about nearly a quarter of them are white evangelicals. Americans under the age of 30, it's less than 1 in 10 identify as white evangelicals today.
And I'll speak very briefly just to the legal argument is almost identical. And has been. There's a Piggy Park barbecue case, which before the Civil Rights Act even went into effect, really. Almost right as it was happening, where they argued, hey, this doesn't apply to us, or it's unconstitutional because our God says that we should keep the races separate. The argument is, our God says this, therefore we are exempt from the law, or the law is unconstitutional. That's the same. That is a through line that you can run through the Bob Jones case that Robbie was talking about earlier, right up to Masterpiece Cake Shop, and into the Fulton versus Philadelphia case, which is going to come down any day now. So the legal arguments are the same. And in that Piggy Park case, the Supreme Court laughed that idea off in a footnote. And now it is a central argument that this court is buying into. We need court reform now. And now that I've talked about that, I'm going to go to Representative Raskin so he can correct everything I just got wrong legally. I think you might be.
So but I'm going to have to run, but I've got all these questions I'm trying to ask you guys, and I think Amanda might be the source of some answers for me. Well, number one, have you ever had a debate with any of these people? Have you challenged them to a debate, a dialogue? That's number one. Number two is, has anybody tried to figure out what happened on January 6th and in the immediate aftermath in terms of sectarian conflict among the insurrectionists? Like, did the people who call themselves fundamentalist Christians have any problem with marching next to neo-Nazis and Klansmen and stuff like that? Or was it just no enemies on the right? We're all, Trump robots. And then my final question is, to what extent do these people come out of like a real Christian faith background versus they're just looking for, a new flag to wrap their racism in? Do you know what I mean? Like, are these people really coming out of a Christian background? Like, were they into like all the pro-life stuff and all that kind of stuff? Or could they just as well have on some kind of Ku Klux Klan or Proud Boy, regalia?
Yeah, well, I'll do my best and have my colleagues jump in here. I mean, I guess on the first point on the debate or dialogue, I have not been in a direct debate with them, but I will say that we've gotten pushback from Christians against Christian nationalism, people writing or talking on talk radio about it. And, I've seen an evolution. At the beginning, they really just put they said, this is just another way to silence Christians. They're labeling us all as Christian nationalists, and this is the way to kick us out of the public square, which we can say, no, the very first bullet point on our statement is people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. We're just trying to take our rightful place right alongside you because you've been taking up all the space for Christians all this time. So I've kind of been engaged in a dialogue by written pieces, but not in a direct one, and something I would love to do, but they don't seem to want to engage. And I think part of that is January 6th was a real turning point, as we've talked about, because I think it got the attention of a lot of Christian leaders who had been sitting on the sidelines for a long time. They don't want to be associated, many of them, with the violence, but they still aren't ready to really grapple with everything that's at the heart of this ideology. They want to kind of cordon off Christian nationalism into this corner, this extremist corner, which in the hands of violent extremists, it can turn deadly, as it did at the Capitol, as it perhaps did in Atlanta last week, as it did at Tree of Life Synagogue and at AME Church. There are lots of examples of violent Christian nationalism. They will decry that, but they're not quite ready to grapple with the harder, more entrenched parts of Christian nationalism. And that's really what we're trying to do, through our project, is to start to question assumptions. Don't just question, why is in God we trust on our money, and why are people trying to put it on school walls, through Project Blitz, but also, why do we have an American flag in our sanctuary? What are we saying about Christian nationalism that's right in our houses of worship? And what about racism and how it's so tied up in Christianity? And I think, Robbie's book has been a real light for a lot of congregations who are looking at it. And, on the question of the Klan and the Proud Boys and all of those, and how different are they? And are they, I think, the Klan has a lot of religious roots itself, right? And so it's all woven, and Robbie talks about this quite a bit in his book. It's all woven together in many ways. And yes, many people who are very attached to Christian nationalism are also, would consider themselves to be deeply religious people. So it's very difficult to kind of parse this out. And so when we talk about it, we talk about Christian nationalism and not Christian nationalists, just like we talk about racism and not racists, because we don't want to put people on the defensive. We want people to look at the ideology and to come at it with a curiosity and a questioning of some of the myths, and a hope that our materials are doing some of that.
Thank you. I got to go. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Andrew, I
Thank
might
you.
just interject a little bit. We've got two other members with questions. In the interest of time, since we're getting near the end, it might be good to let them both go. and then
Okay.
allow the panel to kind of respond to everything that's been posed, and we will bring this thing to a close at that point. Does that make sense?
That makes sense to me.
So why don't we go to Susan and to Steve?
Well, thanks, Jared. Sorry, everybody, I'm driving, but I've got a long drive, and I have to tell you, this has been really a good way to spend a lot of it. So my question, by and large, was answered by one of the speakers. I don't know who, because I'm not looking at the video, but about the age breakdown, and I was wondering whether there was hope to be seen in the fact that these Christian nationalists may just age out at some point. But, you know, at the same time, when, you know, you look at the breakdown of the insurrectionists on January 6th, and a lot of the people that commit some of the heinous crimes in the name of Christianity around the country and around the world, many of them are quite young. And so I mean, I have to tell you, I find the whole subject to be depressing most of the time, because I see so little hope for people to change, people who have these views. You know, I guess I subscribe to President Obama's famous line about people who cling to their God and their guns. But I guess I'm looking for some hope here, quite honestly. I'm looking for some way of viewing this as something that can be, if not eliminated, at least greatly diminished in terms of its power in this country. I wonder if anybody can offer me that.
Well, I mean, I can try at least. I think one of the things that you heard when Robbie did the breakdown of demographics, and kind of one of the common themes that we've been talking about, they are raging against the dying of their privilege. That is what this is right now. The anger and the rage that you're seeing, they are looking out at their congregation. Well, I mean, right now, the last year, they're certainly not seeing anybody. I mean, the congregations are older, the younger people are leaving. The country does not look like the country that they grew up in their minds, demographically or in terms of our quote unquote values. They are raging against the dying of their privilege. And throughout our history, we have seen these different waves of Christian nationalism crest, and then they get relegated back to the fringe whence they came. That I firmly believe that's going to happen. There are a lot of great groups that you can't see because you're busy driving, who are on this call, including the Freedom from Religion Foundation, Baptist Joint Committee, American Atheists, that are doing the frontline work of fighting Christian nationalism, both in the courts and in the court of public opinion. And I have to say that I do think we are winning right now. I think that is part of the reason that they are so vocal and loud and angry. I think we're going to see the myths that undergird the identity trumpeted with more and more vigor as they fade, but they are going to fade.
Let's go ahead and get Congressman Cohen in, and then we can ask all of our panelists to respond to these last several questions and comments that have been made. That'll be a good way to close out, I think. You're muted, Steve. There you go.
Okay. I've enjoyed the discussion very much. Nick Kristof had a nice piece in the Times on Sunday that was relevant to everything we've talked about the evangelicals and where they've gone off the path. You know, one of the lady mentioned, she said the Klan has certain religious roots, and that the people, although Jerry thought, I think it was Jerry, about how they would like marching with the Klan and the Nazis. The Nazis were big time Christians too. And that was a Christian tragedy as well as a Jewish tragedy. The victims was a tragedy, but the oppressors and the intolerant was a tragedy that they took their Christianity and took it to barbarian levels. And the Klan, I got myself in a little trouble back in 2010. I think I referred to the Tea Party as the Klan without robes. And that the Tea Party morphed into the Freedom Caucus, and that's morphed, it's all into this whole evangelical Christian thing. And it's really just the Klan 21st century. It's the same thing. We don't like the Union winning. We don't like the Reconstruction. we're not going to have any of it down here. We don't like the blacks, the Jews. I'm sure they didn't care for the Asians, but they didn't have enough of them. And it's the same thing. It's losing their. But my question is this: have you found any point that would take some of these people away from their belief that Trump was their God, and to let them start to realize that Trump was the Antichrist? Is there some way that you found to get them to understand they were deluded and they need to come back to Christ? I yield back to Pat.
I guess I'll try to take that as we wrap up. And I think it's also a point of hope too, here is that, Trump in many ways, and with reaching a crescendo on January 6th, exposed something in broad daylight that had been more latent for a long time. And I think that now that it has been exposed that there are a number of people, including people who voted for him, including people who were very wedded to some of this Christian nationalism, that are taking a second look, who are questioning some of those assumptions, some of those choices that they made, because of the violent end that we saw on January 6th. And so, I'm hearing just from the interest, the dramatic interest going up, on our campaign after January 6th. There are a number of pastors who are really concerned about what's going on in their congregations. There are a number of denominations that are really talking about de-radicalization now. I think that they understand the threat as something that is really severe, and they're taking it seriously. So, if there can be anything positive that can come out of the awful violence and terrorism that we saw on January 6th, it might be that people are starting to question some of their blind allegiance that we saw for 4 years.
I'll just jump in and follow real quickly because it's pretty similar. So I wrapped the research for my book up in 2019. So far, beyond, well before 2020 and all the things we dealt with in 2020. I'm actually more hopeful today than I was when I wrapped the book up in 2019, believe it or not. And I think it's exactly because of what Amanda just said, that there were so many things that as I was writing the book in 2019, I was struggling to make visible. Like it was just under the surface, and part of the job as an author is to try to make these things visible. And that was part of the heavy lifting of the book, in fact, was trying to kind of bring these things to light. And now they're right there in front of us. And I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is the extreme events of January 6th that resulted in people dying. And we've had this before, also, of course, in Charlottesville and with Dylan Roof and other events. But I think something genuinely new happened in 2020 with people paying attention in a way that I think they haven't before. And I'm with Amanda. I've done over 60 events with local congregations and churches in the past 6 months. That's something, I've never really seen before, that kind of level of interest. And denominations are taking this up. White denominations are taking this up. White churches are partnering with churches of color in their local communities. Like there really is a kind of effervescence happening on the local level that I find hopeful. But I do think the work is here and now, because we are, as Andrew said, we're like on this bubble. We're on this moment of transition, and we just have to ride it through, right? And kind of hold the line, light it through, and kind of show people the way, right? Down, this is a journey of continuity. There are kind of moments we've been at like this before, as Juem noted, and we can get through this together, right? We can get through this as a country, and we can still be one country at the end of it, but it's going to take some work, I think, in the here and now. Really important work right here and now, as people, particularly white conservative Christians, are really struggling. I mean, we've heard that when you do focus groups and stuff, like you hear it in their voices, like they're genuinely confused, right? And I think that's why this work is so important right now. But the good news is I think that a lot of this work is beginning to happen, even at the local congregational level.
Yeah, I generally not very hopeful, but I think I will finish with a hopeful note. I usually remember, I'm kind of like in these crossroads in which I'm part of two demographics that these groups don't like too much. I'm a humanist and I'm a Latino. And I'm technically young for some of those demographics, but I think I'm hopeful about the future for a few reasons. One is that I think all what transpired during the Trump administration and this rise of like forefront of the Christian nationalism also happened at the same time that these, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think those two events happening at the same time actually was very important for the consciousness of the country, realizing, especially after January 6th, how the Christian nationalists and the insurrectionists were treated compared to the protesters over the summer. And even now looking at the two most recent tragedies in which white perpetrators are being treated with kids' gloves by the police. I think a lot of people are internalizing those differences that they're just told in stories, and they're just realizing how different the treatment is in this country when you have privilege. And so I think especially young people are internalizing that much better. But I'm seeing a big change in the attitudes of the country regarding that. And I think if there's something good to come out of these events, is that people are finally seeing it in the most vivid image that they could have seen it in less than a year. How Black people and people of color and young people are treated when they're protesting against racism, and how a group of Christian nationalists are treated when they're trying to overthrow the government.
Yeah, I mean, that was such a stark difference seeing that unfold that day. And to Amanda and Robbie's, and this will be the last point I make, I mean, about the theological debate and the maybe the theological awakening, Robbie, I don't know if that's the right term for it or not. It's fascinating. It's really interesting. I think it's a little bit problematic for members of Congress, though. I mean, Christians against Christian nationalism is going to be a phenomenal ally going forward on this, but we still probably don't want members of Congress defining what Christianity is for citizens, but you can certainly define what America is. So I think we can recognize that Christian nationalism is still Christian, that it's a faith-based initiative in a way. But people are uncomfortable discussing it in any of those other terms, and I think that's a problem. So I think it's okay for us to say that Christian nationalism is Christian, but I think we can attack it better from the point that it is fundamentally un-American, that it seeks to redefine the American identity, that it seeks to essentially unite state and church, and it's that part that everyone, including elected government officials, who probably can't weigh in on theology or what is Christian and not, can take part in. And we can all work to undermine the disinformation that sustains their identity. So we can proclaim, that America was not founded as a Christian nation, which is sort of the central thesis of their identity. And I will leave it at that because we are way over, and the representatives who joined this panel, and I will let Representative Huffman close us out here.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for your steady hand guiding us through a really important conversation. I think the level of engagement you saw from members of Congress tells you that this is a super important subject and a really timely one that we're all struggling with. To our panelists, Robbie, Juhem, Amanda, I really appreciate, I know all of us appreciate the depth of knowledge and the scholarship and expertise you brought to this conversation. We thank you for the good work that you're doing in your respective roles. And I loved, frankly, the interchange between a religionist and two secular advocates collaborating on an important subject. There's a lot we can work on together. And the Freethought Caucus is going to keep bringing important conversations like this. So stay with us and stay tuned. Our Thomas Paine breakfast is coming next. Details to follow. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.